Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 115. This week's questions are taken from the guide to the French ship Gascogne that was never built, that's guide 180, and the Wednesday video on British cruiser development between World War I and World War II. Adam Ladd asks, why was the barrel wear on the 37mm mounts mentioned so awful, and how much of an issue would this have been in service? So there are three primary reasons, one of which was that the 37mm mounts were capable of just a truly horrific rate of fire, at least if you're the aircraft coming at them. So to give some idea, the rate of fire on the 40mm Bofors, which is generally considered to be obviously a very good medium caliber anti-aircraft gun in World War II, that was around about 80 to 100 rounds normally, maybe pushing up to 120 rounds if you had someone really good on the reload per minute. The demonstrated rate of fire that the 37mm was capable of was something in the regions of 160 to 170 rounds a minute. So some would think between double to maybe trending down towards 50% greater rate of fire over the 40mm Bofors, depending on exactly what rate of fire on the Bofors you use. So just more rounds passing through the barrel a lot faster is going to wear the barrel a lot quicker, both because it's more rounds per minute and also because the timing between the individual rounds leaves less time for the barrel to cool. Now, there's two other issues, as I mentioned, one of which is the fact because these things were truly automatic practically belt fed, whereas with the Bofors at least you had sort of the gravity assist chute or the various clips that were put in, which meant that when you're firing off these rounds it would just be a continuous stream of rounds, whereas with the Bofors, even if you had a really good loader, chances are there'd be the occasional slight interrupt, and when you're talking about gun barrels heating up, even an interrupt of 1 or 2 rounds worth may make all the difference when it comes to barrel wear if you're talking about sustained fire. And lastly was the fact that it's a 37mm cartridge, so it's a little bit smaller than a 40mm, but it uses roughly the same working pressure to project the round as the upper end of the Bofors 40mm installations did. And so that means there's proportionally significantly more power behind each individual round, which of course oversized cartridge effectively means more barrel wear. So combine all of these together and you get basically a barrel that, if you go full auto, is going to heat up very quickly, start to wear very quickly. As for how much of an issue this would have been in service, as a logistical matter, and especially a matter in peacetime, it would have been pretty bad. In wartime, I don't think it would have been that much of a problem outside of the fact the ship would have had to carry a significant stock of spare barrels and probably have a bunch of people quite well trained in replacing them relatively fast, because at the end of the day, if you're going to be facing an incoming air attack, you really want the ability to hose the area down with fire as quickly and as consistently as possible. And any individual air attack that lasts for more than a minute is probably something that you're probably going to die from anyway. And I don't mean that in terms of the continuous, here come the dive bombers, here come the torpedo bombers, etc., etc. What I mean is, if you've got a continuous stream of aircraft that are just hitting you again and again and again and again to the point that your guns are firing consistently for more than a minute or two before they get a chance to cool off, at that point you're probably going to be overwhelmed anyway. So in any kind of realistic engagement scenario, I don't think the barrel wear in and of itself would have been a major problem in the fight, and the advantages conferred by the mounting would have definitely been worth it. The difference would have been that any engagement of any significant size against aircraft would have been followed almost immediately, once the barrels had cooled to a temperature you could actually handle them, with getting a party out there to replace all the gun barrels. Which, as I say, that would have been a minor hiccup, but it would have been worth it in my opinion, given the potential effectiveness of the mount. Dan Haas asks, the two-turret layout of the Gascogne design, combined with the strong secondary battery, seems to be almost a return to the pre-dreadnought style of design philosophy with only one turret forward and one aft. How would such a design have fared in the World War II period if pitted against the more conventional super-dreadnought designs used by most navies at the time? Do you think this design philosophy would have had any real future if the war had continued longer? Personally, I'm not a massive fan of the layout of Gascogne. I think the French were definitely onto something with the Richelieu layout with the two quads forward, and I certainly prefer that over this alternative layout. Now, the thing is, the advantages of the Gascogne layout versus the Richelieu layout effectively amount to we can fire in 360 with at least some of our main battery, and perhaps more beneficially we can have a slightly better coverage with our secondary battery because they had super firing secondary turrets up front. Now, in the World War II era, I don't think that either of those things actually makes a fantastic amount of difference. If the secondary battery had been fully dual purpose, and I know the French did want it to be dual purpose, but it never quite worked out. But if it had been, say, things like something like a stepped 5-inch 38 mounting or 4.5-inch mounting or French equivalent, then maybe I could have seen that, because having all-round anti-aircraft cover would certainly be a significant benefit in the World War II environment, as opposed to, I mean, having the broadsides for your secondary battery is always good for obvious reasons, but having the centerline super firing style dual purpose secondary battery would allow you to present significantly more weight of fire to either broadside or the front arc for less weight, because obviously centerline guns can be used on both sides. But that isn't strictly the case with the Gascogne type layout, so that kind of goes by the wayside. And to be perfectly honest, if you are in a position where the enemy is in your aft quarter, i.e. an area where Richelieu wouldn't be able to use its main battery guns, something's already gone horribly wrong. It basically means either you're running away from your enemy or your enemy's managed to surprise you from aft, at which point, well, if the enemy's managed to surprise you and you still want to engage them, then just turn. It's not going to take a tremendous amount of time. And if you are in the process of actually legitimately running away from your enemy, well, having half a main battery to fire back at them, if they're so strong that you're running away in the first place, is probably not going to do all that much other than maybe provide a slight deterrent against them closing to point-blank range. And if you're in a Richelieu-derived hull and you're capable of doing 30-plus knots, what enemy exactly are you facing that's going to scare you into running away and is faster than you? About the only thing that was actually built at the time period that would potentially tick that box would be the Iowa, because the Richelieu can outrun Yamato. And if you're fighting against an Iowa, having 4 15-inch guns to face off against 6 16-inch 50s, well, it's not really much of a benefit, to be perfectly honest. And it came with a whole load of disadvantages as well. It obviously meant that the aft deck couldn't be used for quite as much heavy and medium AA. It meant that they had to realign the entire ship. It meant they had to extend the belt, which meant more weight. So yeah, if it was pitted against more conventional designs in as just a straight-up fight, like, say, going up against Bismarck or King George V or Littorio or Nagato, I suppose, because putting up against Yamato is not really fair, it would have done all right. I mean, it's the same kind of armament that Richelieu has. The restriction is that, obviously, it has to be more broadside, which gives it less tactical flexibility. I think if you put Gascogne or Richelieu up against one of those ships, Richelieu would do better, because it can do broadside just as well, but it can also come in bearing sort of not quite full bow on, ideally, but sort of partially bow on, which it's not so much about angling the armor plate, it's more about just reducing your target profile, making you much harder to hit in the first place. So I think Richelieu would have the advantage. The only place I can see Richelieu maybe not having quite so much of an advantage would be in a kind of Operation 10 Ghost swarming air attack, where Gascogne having slightly more forward arc AA firepower might allow it to survive a few more minutes, but again, this is what the rudder is for. And the flip side to that is obviously that a fully fitted out Richelieu with its aft deck and amidships all covered in AA is probably actually still a more formidable opponent than having things scattered and distributed when you don't have a fully dual purpose capable secondary battery. Gottjäger asks, what technical issues prevented the implementation of single-stroke loading mechanisms on battleship-scale guns earlier? This is fairly important because it is effectively in many ways one of the prerequisites for auto-loading battleship guns, which would be quite the terrifying prospect. The main reason comes down to the ammunition and charge. So with 6-inch ammunition, although quite a lot of 6-inch ammunition was made in two parts, i.e. the shell and the cartridge for the charge, you could in some ways and in some ships have single part 6-inch ammunition. With the 8-inch auto-loading guns on the Des Moines class, which are demonstrated here, you can see the charge was held in a single brass case. So it was 2-part ammunition, but that could be assembled. And the thing is, with the automated technology of the 1940s, you could just about, by the time of the Des Moines, trust the technology to have both the lifting capability and the precision to put together an 8-inch shell and its cartridge and then load it all in a single stroke and fire it. When it comes to battleship grade guns, however, the story is quite different, because they need multiple stacked charges, which are usually contained in bags, and even the Germans who in World War I who famously used brass cartridges for their ammunition, the brass cartridge was the last charge, it wasn't the whole thing, so they still had to build it up out of multiple charge bags. It's just the last one was slightly easier and slightly safer. And to be perfectly honest, with 1940s automation tech, given the weight of the shell and the weight of the individual charges, which is why they're in so many segments in the first place, getting the technology precise enough to be able to put together these fairly non-rigid charges in a nice long stack, then needing the massive hydraulic power stroke that you would need to shove the whole thing into the gun at once, and ensuring that with that massive power stroke going in, that none of these slightly compressible charges bent, compressed, snagged, etc. So you've got a clean feed in. That is an incredibly difficult proposition as compared to getting a 6-inch or even an 8-inch gun with a rigid cartridge and shell body to actually auto-load. And of course, needless to say, the prospects of what would happen if one of those charges was slightly off or collapsed slightly and the whole thing just got bunched up and squashed into the base of the breach with a bunch of detonators and a very, very powerful hydraulic arm running up behind it. I don't think I need to go any further as to what the consequences of that could have been. So yeah, the amount of automation that you'd need, even if you could somehow make one that you trusted, would be so extensive that you would probably end up with, shall we say, a gun turret that would probably end up being slightly bigger than the average triple turret and not actually able to fit 3 guns. You would probably need to take out the center gun to free up space for the auto-loading tech. Now, at some point down the line, the Royal Navy thought they were onto something with auto-loading 16s for the Lion class, but one, they gave it up as a bad idea, and two, I haven't seen the precise details of how they're going to try and solve that problem. I, at some point, we'll need to hunt down which archive actually has the full documentation and have a look and see exactly why they reckoned it was impractical, whether it was size considerations, reliability considerations, weight considerations, or something else. But in the end, the auto-loading Lions were not built, so that's kind of the ultimate vote as to whether or not that system would have worked, outside of other practical considerations about building brand new battleships post-World War II. Green Machine 0555 asks, is there a time frame in which we can expect the finale of the Destroyer development series? I'm probably going to say first quarter next year, and I think it's probably going to have to be 2 videos, because with the Destroyer development from the first to World War I and then the interwar, you haven't had to deal so much with the combat lessons and wartime builds, because World War I, to be honest, most of the wartime builds were basically repeats of something that they had at the beginning. There was a little bit of advancement, but not a tremendous amount. Whereas if you look at the range, scope and scale of wartime builds in World War II, they're all over the shop. Everything from smaller, cheaper ships that we can mass produce all the way up to the latest and greatest and most advanced destroyer designs of the period. And on top of that, you've got to cope with the actual wartime lessons, the wartime engagements, etc., etc. So from what I can tell of the status of the script so far, there's no practical way for me to fit that even into an hour, hour and a half. So I'm probably going to have to split it into 2, one of which will be just the very simple, these are the destroyer classes that were built and developed and roughly why during that last stage of World War II onto 1950, and then a separate video which will talk all about the lessons learnt and the wartime experiences of how to use destroyers, which is obviously an integral part of their development, because I can't see any realistic way to compress both of those into that time period, unfortunately. This is one of the biggest problems with all of the sort of history of development of series, whether it's destroyers or carriers or whatever, is that with any one of those ships, there's literally books, entire, fairly thick, substantial books written about single classes, and then having to cover several dozen in the case of destroyers, or about a dozen in the case of carriers, in an hour, which amounts to maybe about 12 to 15 pages of script. It requires an awful lot of compression and deciding what to take out, what to summarize, and what to leave in full. It is a fair bit of work, and plus obviously you've got to cross-check and make sure that these things are as reliable and as accurate as you can reasonably make them. Andre Silva asks, if HMS Ark Royal, HMS Eagle and USS Wasp survived their fates, what would be their careers in the remainder of World War II? In reverse order, if Wasp had survived the torpedoing, presumably because they miss, then she probably would have taken part in continued air operations during 1942, because the US was critically short of carriers. She may well have then ended up meeting her end in one of the other engagements, because she wasn't able really to take all that much damage. But assuming that she made it out of those battles through hook or by crook, by the time you get into early 1943 and various new US carriers are coming online, she'd probably see her last dose of action in the Pacific supporting Saratoga and USS Robin in their patrol waiting for Enterprise to come back out of dock. Because once Enterprise is around, Saratoga is around, Robin can go home, and Essex is then coming online in the Pacific around about May 1943. So Wasp would probably then be returned to the Atlantic and probably operate alongside Ranger in a variety of roles, probably aircraft ferrying into the Mediterranean, Arctic convoy and Norwegian strike missions, that kind of thing. And she'd probably just serve out the rest of the war in that role. Eagle, if she survives the convoy run where she ended up being torpedoed, she'd probably continue to do convoy runs as effectively a fighter carrier for escort purposes. And I think she'd probably just remain in the Mediterranean on those kind of duties for probably the rest of the Mediterranean conflict, as long as she can continue to survive those. Once you get to the end of that, and again, you've got with the UK, you've got the various armoured carriers being patched up, and ships like Implacable coming down the line. The Italian fleet's no longer an issue. You might see her being used as a convoy escort for part of the Arctic convoys, but it will probably be relegated to a secondary role because of her limited speed and air group. I don't think she'd be sent out with the Pacific Fleet. I think by the time of the end of the war, she'd probably be in the same kind of status as HMS Furious. Ark Royal, on the other hand, if it survives its torpedoing by a U-boat near Gibraltar, Ark Royal is big enough and has enough carrying capacity that it probably will continue to be a frontline unit, much like Enterprise in the US Navy, for the entirety of the rest of the Second World War. Her lack of armour protection is going to be possibly something of an issue when it comes to Pacific operations. If she gets hit as hard as some of the armoured carriers did by kamikaze, she will suffer a lot more. I suppose the flip side to that is she does have a lot larger air group, which is kind of rehashing a lot of the debates between US and UK carrier designs during the war. But I suspect in the intermediate point between her historical sinking and the advent of the British Pacific Fleet, which she would be a part of, she'd probably end up being part of Somerville's force during the Indian Ocean raid, because that is the kind of operational theatre she was designed for. She'd probably then go on to, like Eagle and Victorious and various other carriers, be used strategically once the Mediterranean conflict was over in Arctic convoy protection and strike missions against Norway, particularly against Tirpitz. And I think she probably would have remained in the Western Mediterranean and Southern Atlantic for the period up until the Italian surrender, because while she does have the capability of operating a reasonably sized air group, her lack of deck armour protection relative to things like the Illustrious class will probably mean the Royal Navy would be unwilling to send her into the heart of the Mediterranean unless Cunningham was absolutely desperate for carriers. Which would lead to a rather interesting situation, because if she then survives World War II, whilst Wasp and Eagle almost certainly would have gone to the breakers' yards shortly thereafter, Ark Royal, because of her size, is probably actually better placed to operate aircraft, modern jet aircraft, in the post-World War II environment than quite a lot of the armoured carriers with their smaller flight decks and smaller hangars would have been. Which in turn, the thing is, she'd also be the most worn because she'd be the oldest fleet carrier. So potentially that could lead to a very long career, because if she has the kind of deep, massive refit and rebuild that Victorious got, that would pretty much renew her for service for a good couple of decades longer, and she'd be much, much better placed to take that refit. So potentially, if she survives the entirety of World War II, she could actually maybe even see service well into the 60s, although that does obviously then raise the question of what are they going to call the Audacious class that historically was called Ark Royal. And she'll probably serve alongside whatever the not Ark Royal Audacious was called, and the Eagle, the Audacious class for one, probably well into living memory for the majority of us. Assuming, of course, that budget cuts don't get her, but I mean, Victorious lasted a reasonably long time. Commissar's House asks, I'm struck by a picture at the beginning of the video, this is the British cruisers one, with two cruisers underway, in particular the absence of handrails running along the deck, which I'm used to seeing present on ships in World of Warships and in other pictures elsewhere. What was the practice with them? So I can't be 100% definitive here, because there's two ways of looking at it. One is the fact that a lot of these handrails and such can just fold down and fold over the sides, which makes it relatively easy to do. In other cases, they do appear to have been removed for periods of time. And as I say, I can't be entirely definitive here, but from what I've read of, I say, not, I was going to say not official sources. They are official sources, like Admiralty documents and such, but they're not the parts of the sources that carry the weight of command, i.e. they're not instructions from captains, commodores, admirals, etc. They are comments by individual ships officers and men. And from what I've been able to gather, it basically comes down to the fact that, especially when you're talking about small World War I cruisers, who are most vulnerable to this kind of thing, but a lot of people were looking at the lessons of, say, things like the Battle of Tsushima, where the pipes, tubes and wires that make up handrails, when ships are subjected to high explosive fire, very quickly turn into kind of scything, whirling bits of death-dealing shrapnel, a bit like bar shot in The Age of Sail. And on a cruiser, especially a World War I cruiser, relatively small, unarmoured, completely unarmoured superstructure, very high density of men, usually either open gun mounts, or if they're shielded, not particularly thickly shielded gun mounts with open backs. That kind of stuff can massively magnify the effect of an incoming shell. So if you're facing combat and you can quickly drop your handrails, quick 180 onto the side of the hull, where obviously if they are then blasted in, they're going to blast just into the hull structure itself, which will be a bit thicker and not scythe across the deck, then that is a very good idea. There are also some comments about people just flat out removing them, but they seem to be in the minority. And obviously it's much more common practice on smaller ships where, say, the crew is more exposed, the ship is less armoured, and they're far more likely to be hit by high explosive shells in the first place. Whereas on battleships, although again you just still do want to try and reduce the amount of shrapnel, most, if not all, crew on a battleship in combat, especially during the First World War, are going to be behind some kind of armour protection, or because of the sheer size of the battleship, they'll be far enough away from the main deck that, well, I wouldn't necessarily say they're completely immune to shrapnel, but they're less likely to be hit by it. And of course, battleships generally, by that period, are supposed to be being hit by armour-piercing shells, which are going to be detonating inside, and not so much by surface detonating high explosive shells that would be the main cause of this kind of issue. In this particular case, I think if you look very carefully on the deck edge of the closest ship, you can just about see some of the stanchions. So I suspect at this point on this ship, they've folded it down the sides of the ship for safety reasons, as discussed previously. But, let's say, in some places, they were just flat out taken out. Josh Thomas Moore asks, during the Age of Sail, did anyone try and put some kind of rocket or Katyushka type rocket battery on ships' boats for landings? Well, you might think at first the concept of an LSTR, except wooden and oar powered in the late 17th, early 18th centuries, might seem absurd, but in actual fact, believe it or not, they kind of tried it. That was thanks to the wonderful invention of the Congreve rocket, obviously during the 18th century. Now, whilst, yes, it was tried, it wasn't exactly the world's most rip-roaring success. As any historian of that period will tell you, the Congreve rocket was a wonderful idea in principle, and it was more accurate than most other forms of rocket-based weaponry at the time, but that's not a particularly high bar to clear, considering the default for rocket-based artillery in that period was reasonable chance of exploding on launch, reasonable chance of travelling backwards into your own lines, semi-reasonable chance of attempting to become the world's first orbital projectile, and a small but non-negligible chance of actually heading in the vague direction of the enemy. The fact that the Congreve rockets tended to head in at least roughly the 180-degree arc that described the direction of your opponent more than 50% of the time made them substantially better weapons, but not massively fantastical. They were very good at area bombardments. If you wanted to just set fire to something over there, And the morale effect was also occasionally quite useful because people weren't used to them. Now, that is all when the rocket launch is on land. They did try to mount Congreve rockets on ships, particularly on bomb ships, as they were called at the time, which were sort of the early shore bombardment specialized vessels. And you can imagine, well, if their accuracy is not fantastic on land, their accuracy when you're on a ship which is moving, either underway or just bobbing around at anchor, yeah, the accuracy went down even further, although, again, they were used. And, yes, there were a few cases where some enterprising person thought, well, if it's a lightweight thing, it doesn't weigh anywhere near as much as a cannon, let's see if I can put this on a ship's boat and launch it close to the shore. Yes, you technically could, but all the problems with movement that you happen to have on a ship are magnified quite significantly when you're on a boat approaching the shoreline. And so it was kind of nice idea, but maybe not. Now, with that said, whilst the firing of rockets from ships' boats for amphibious landing purposes wasn't so brilliant, the use of rockets from ships, well, vessels that kind of straddle the line between large boat and small ship, as well as bombardment vessels, frigates, etc., was quite extensively practiced by the Royal Navy during the Napoleonic War period in varying engagements to varying degrees of success. Some of them had basically no success, others were quite spectacularly successful. So just because they weren't necessarily LSTRs 200 years earlier didn't make them entirely useless, and you can actually read about quite a few different engagements in which rockets were used to varying effect. And of course, there is a line in the US national anthem, obviously, "By the rocket's red glare," and that reflects the use of rockets against a fortification, albeit, as I say, launched for bombardment purposes from a somewhat larger vessel, as opposed to a small rowboat trying to support landing troops. Arctic Temper asks, how practical could a squadron of seaplanes tasked with picking up survivors of sinking ships be? Now, that is a very complex question, and I don't think there's any particular straight answer to it, because using seaplanes or flying boats to pick up survivors definitely was done and was exceptionally useful during the Second World War. You can see here some aviators being picked up by Catalina. However, there are limitations to this. One is that the size of the flying boat is going to dictate how many people you can pick up, and obviously the size of the crew of the ship is going to have a bearing on that as well. A Catalina can quite happily pick up a couple of aviators or so from a downed fighter or dive bomber or torpedo bomber, no problem. But when you're talking about ships, even a small merchant ship is going to have several dozen crew, and as we know, when a warship goes down, if it's lucky enough that most of the crew get off, you could be looking at hundreds of people, pushing maybe even up to 1,000 in the water, and there's no flying boat that can take up that many survivors. There's also the flip side that when you've got people scattered all over the place in the water, if you send in a flying boat or flying boats large enough to actually make a dent in the numbers in the water, so something more along the lines of a Mariner or a short Sunderland, they have a fair amount of approach and landing distance that is required and are obviously very heavy. So if you're trying to land in waters where there's lots of scattered survivors, that could run some pretty nasty hazards involved with possibly running down the very people you're trying to save. The alternative, of course, would be to land further away and try and taxi in, which obviously would take more time and would still have some risks attached to it. And you've also got to try and hope that the weather is calm enough for the flying boat to land, because even a big flying boat can only land in sea states that are so high. And then outside of the abstract, there's also the matter of resources to consider. Do you have the resources to devote several squadrons of large flying boats away from, say, anti-submarine warfare patrol to be a kind of quick reaction rescue force, because if you're talking about ships being sunk, you've also got to think about where are they being sunk. If they're being sunk in convoy, it's probably much quicker and more efficient for other ships in the convoy to grab them, and indeed there were specific rescue ships built into convoys after a while. If you're talking about ships in a fleet, again, probably better for the other ships in the fleet to rescue them, because they'll probably be there faster unless you've got rescue flying boats circling like vultures waiting for somebody to keel over, and of course a ship is always going to be able to take far more men than any flying boat. If it's a ship with a relatively small number of crew, well then if it's a merchant ship it should be in a convoy, and if it's a small vessel like a destroyer or some other form of escort, again it should be with a fleet. So there's always going to be a more proximate rescue. There is a slight fine balance where if you've got an area that's just a very, very dense operational area in overall strategic terms, but maybe not particularly dense in terms of having lots of individual ships in close proximity to each other, like say the Guadalcanal campaign, in that case, then yes, there may be a certain argument to be made. Sort of like if a PT boat goes down, or one of the APD converted destroyers that's a transport goes down, they may be hours, if not more, away from another friendly ship that can help, and with relatively nearby air bases, if they manage to get off some kind of distress signal, then yes, at that point half a dozen large flying boats might be able to pick up the crew of an APD, one or two might be able to grab a PT boat's crew, that kind of thing. But then in that kind of scenario you're probably going to end up with contested skies, and you don't necessarily want to send unescorted heavy flying boats in the face of enemy fighters, which complicates things because then you've got to provide an escort, and even then the escort might not be able to do all that much if the flying boat is caught while it's on the surface. It only takes one to really ruin a flying boat's day. So yeah, there's a lot of pros and cons. The main thing is just the capacity and why does the ship need a flying boat rescue force in the first place. But there are certain circumstances where it might be useful. The other circumstance I can think where it might be quite handy is coastal convoys, especially somewhere like the US, and areas like that where you might legitimately have relatively low crew ships sailing, relatively speaking, unaccompanied, and might be in need of rapid reaction rescue. Eric Fapton asks, in World War II, how long could a ship keep on fighting if its engines were knocked out? How long do batteries last, and can they keep a ship firing its main battery without any electricity? It depends greatly on the ship for two primary reasons. One of which is that the ship's power plant, which shockingly enough provides most of the power for things like the either electric motors or hydraulic systems that will help you move, load, aim and fire guns and such like. In some ships, that machinery space will all be grouped together, so you have all the boilers in one bit and all the turbines in another, and that layout is slightly more efficient in terms of space saving, but much more vulnerable to a single hit. So if you take a hit to the relevant space, that's it, power gone, or at least main power is gone. Whereas on other ships, they take what's called the unit approach, where you alternate boilers and turbines, and so if any one of those compartments is flooded or destroyed by a shell hit or whatever, then there are still other sections of the ship's machinery, I should say, which can still provide power. And so in the first case, no power. In the second case, you'll still have some power. That may be just lower power output generally across the ship, or it may be that a sector of the ship loses power and another sector of the ship doesn't, depending on how the ship is wired up, or piped up if we're talking about hydraulics. And the second factor is whether the ship has backup generators. Now, obviously, some ships do, some ships don't. Some ships that do, there's different power output levels from those generators. They wouldn't run on batteries. There's no realistic battery array that you would plausibly fit into a battleship that's going to be able to keep the main battery in operation for any significant length of time and if in theory you somehow wanted to, the amount of space that would be taken up would be horrendous. So it's more about, have you lost your ship's entire machinery output, combined with, if you have, how much power have you actually got in your backup generators. But if you've lost all power from your engines and you either don't have enough power from your backup generators or you don't have them, period, your ship's not going to fight at all, because the sheer amount of energy involved in moving and the main battery around, you need some fairly substantial juice behind that. And if you lose it, I'd love to see someone try to hand crank a triple 16-inch turret, but that would be more out of morbid curiosity as to how long it would take them to give up than expecting any actual results. And onto the Patreon question segment. NickBoy302 asks, did the Royal Navy ever resent sending valuable officers and men to the Dominion navies, or was it a case of the British sending excess personnel somewhere useful? I definitely don't think generally that they resented it. A lot of the time, especially during the 18th and 19th centuries especially, getting Royal Navy officers to stay put was often quite the challenge. They had this habit of going off to form, lead, or command elements of other navies when nothing particularly exciting was going on in Britain. And you see this quite a lot with a lot of Napoleonic era officers, and through the 19th century you'll find British captains and such like on leave or on half pay, quite merrily fighting their own small wars as the captains, commodores or admirals of smaller nations' navies. So giving British officers an opportunity to go overseas and do something a bit more exciting than patrol the North Sea and glare angrily at the French was a win-win as far as everyone was concerned, because the officers got to go and do something and the Royal Navy got to keep them not starting wars on their own, and the Dominion navies got a bit of an experience boost from obviously having trained naval officers come to help form up and lead elements of their newborn navies. And as you transition to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, again, it's a case of, well, if we send these officers over to the Dominion Navy to help out, that in turn is strengthening the Dominion Navy. The Dominion Navy is almost certainly going to be fighting alongside us when it comes to potential war, at which point having a much stronger, much more capable Dominion Navy backing you up in exchange for a handful of officers is a massive advantage and a really good deal for both sides. And especially when those officers, obviously you try and send some good ones, they pass on their learning and experience, the Dominion Navy takes up that learning and experience and effectively picks up the ball and runs with it, and then you get a situation in circumstances like World War II, when the relatively small Royal Australian Navy is sending ships left, right and centre, and you get Australian ships showing up in the Mediterranean, and Admiral Cunningham is just looking and going, fantastic, can we have more please? So yeah, the Australian Navy was very, very highly rated by most senior officers in the Royal Navy during World War II, and similarly with things like the Royal Canadian Navy, whilst they didn't operate quite the same level of cruiser force that the Australians did, they went from a relatively small force to a very, very large numerical force and very useful and very hard-wearing force when it came to Atlantic convoy escorts and such, because, well, it should come as relatively little surprise to most people that when you're asked to sail out in mountainous seas with the occasional risks of ice and extended periods of darkness, crews that have grown up on the Canadian East Coast are probably like, oh, Tuesday, you mean? So yes, very definitely worth the effort. Vinve asks, during World War II, how much would British civilians with an interest in naval matters actually have known about what the Royal Navy was up to? Not taking account really big secrets like Ultra and Enigma, how soon after the war were most things made public? It depends on two factors, really. Location, and also the precise sensitivity of the operation in question. For example, if you were a naval enthusiast in the heart of the Pennines for some reason. Let's say, for those of you who are unaware of British geography, that's basically central England in terms of east-west, and up north in terms of north-south. Then during World War II, you're basically relying on what the government tells you, because you don't really have any easy way to get other information unless somebody nearby has a family member who's in the Navy. Whereas if you are a naval enthusiast in, say, Portsmouth or Rosyth, or Plymouth, or even the London docks, you're probably going to know an awful lot more about what's been going on than most people, because, well, sailors like to have a drink, sailors like to talk, there's going to be an awful lot of them in the port, and even with wartime security and the sort of loose lips sink ships kind of thing, if you knew where to go, you could probably pick up on a fair few details, not necessarily fully classified ones, but maybe just details that weren't being said. So, for example, if, say, a destroyer is published as lost, it might say, well, it was lost to German attack. That might be the newspaper headline or the news headline. But if you happen to be in the home port and some survivors came back, or some ships that had helped rescue the survivors, you might then find out that, oh, it was lost to a mine, or it was lost to air attack. And you might also find out that, oh, well, we were on the way to attack a convoy, or we were defending one of our own convoys against a submarine, or something like that. There's where you might find out some additional details. And some stuff is actually really mundane, but was tweaked just a little bit and carried on for quite a while. So one of the viewers recently wrote to me and let me know that, in connection with the Narvik video, for example, the picture that we now know is HMS Forester poking in to help out HMS Cossack when it had gone aground. For a very, very long time, the official line was, oh no, this is just Forester and Cossack in Narvik Harbour. But if you asked anyone who'd been on Forester or Cossack or been observing, they would have told you, no, Cossack was aground. It wasn't a secret. It was just a little bit of, shall we say, misinformation, the official line that was for general consumption. But you could easily find out if you knew the right people to talk to, before, of course, the files were released and it turned out that, yes, in fact, Cossack had been aground. Miko Leitnan asks, could the US Navy have gotten any useful service out of the ships of the line demolished at the Norfolk Naval Yard in 1861? As ships of the line themselves, possibly. Some of them weren't in the best condition, others were in better condition. So for the ones that they could make sailable relatively quickly, then given that a lot of the Union Navy's job was blockade duty, sure, they would have made pretty good ships for that. I mean, being ships of the line, larger capacity, they would have made excellent command ships. They've got the firepower, certainly, to stand up to anything in particular that might come out as a blockade runner. They're not going to be massively more useful against the ironclads because, well, they might break a few things by sheer volume of fire, but equally they're not going to have any substantially heavier guns than something like the Cumberland, and we all know what happened when Virginia came out to take on that particular frigate. So there would have been some limited use for them, but I suspect that their manning requirements might have actually caused them to be razzed if the Union Navy could pull it off quickly enough. What might have been more useful out of them, which is why I've got this picture up at the moment, is conversion of them into ironclads. Now, the picture in question is Royal Sovereign, because of course all of the ships were, as you say, burned at Norfolk Naval Yard. HMS Royal Sovereign, on the other hand, was a large ship of the line in the middle of the 19th century. And when the ironclads came about, she was cut down and converted, in this particular case, into a turret ship. But from a sort of quick build perspective, if you've got a bunch of ships of the line, maybe not in great condition, high manning requirements, and obviously limited functionality, as we've discussed because it's blockade duty, But you suddenly hear about, there's this thing called CSS Virginia that's being built, and you need to crash course build some ironclads of your own, which of course is what the Union actually had to do. Given that you get Monitor, Galena, and new Ironsides out of that, it might well have stood them in very good stead to go, well, hang on a minute, we don't need to build a hull, or maybe you build Monitor anyway, and probably even new Ironsides, but with something, with another option would be, well, we don't need to build a hull, we have a hull already, we can just cut the masts down, maybe cut a deck or two down, fit it with an auxiliary engine or something like that, basically do a quick conversion and slap some iron armor on it, and then we have a fairly substantial ironclad. Now, okay, maybe there's still build Galena, new Ironsides, and Monitor, and certainly Monitor specifically in the fast reaction to CSS Virginia, but if they kicked off that process of conversion at the same time as they started, say, building new Ironsides, you might have ended up with a fairly useful set of broadside ironclads, or broadside ironclad conversions that you can then use in the mid and latter stages of the American Civil War, and they obviously will then carry a fairly substantial battery and also be somewhat more seaworthy than some of the various Monitor offerings. Bill Brockman asks, during Operation Hailstone, USS Iowa and New Jersey famously fired at the Japanese destroyer Nowaki at up to 39,000 yard range. What sort of salvos were they firing, and what would be the ideal tactic for both sides, such as salvo chasing by Nowaki? So the two battleships, were firing very different salvos. If you look at the number of salvos versus rounds expended, New Jersey was effectively firing 2-gun and 3-gun part salvos the entire time. Iowa expended considerably more shells, actually with fewer salvos, roughly 40 shells with 5 salvos, which by simple maths indicates that she was firing she definitely fired at least one, possibly more full salvos, as well as possibly a bunch of 6-gun salvos. So very, very different behaviour by the two different ships. Now, in terms of ideal tactics for both sides, well, the US Navy pretty much did the best that it could. New Jersey slightly messed up by firing salvos from alternating turrets, and that's going to make the fine control of the salvos a little bit harder, because of course, especially when you're talking about 30,000 plus range, the minute differences in ballistics from the fact that the two turrets are very slightly different lengths from your main fire control system. They're at very slightly different heights, and of course there are going to be very, very slight mechanical differences as well. All gets amplified by the range to mean that New Jersey was probably unlikely to ever actually get a hit, although it does appear that she was the one that scored a straddle close enough to cause splinter damage. And at this kind of range, you probably just want as many shells as possible in the air, because the scatter is going to be such that even if the target stays on exactly the course and speed that you've plotted, you're going to need as many chances for effectively at this point a random hit from the distribution of shells. So yeah, firing either 6-gun salvos from both forward turrets, or even 9-gun salvos from the entire ship, you might as well give it a go. It's going to slightly increase your chances of hitting. Iowa was probably slightly more on the money with its overall tactical approach, but when it comes to Nowaki's tactics, it pretty much did the perfect tactic. Now, bear in mind that the kind of ranges we're talking about, they couldn't actually see the entire destroyer. They could only see the upper parts of the destroyer, and that was from the spotting tops. It was a seriously long range. But the Japanese captain pretty much did the spot-on perfect tactic, and this is why he wasn't hit. And this, in a lot of ways, actually illustrates one of the reasons I'd say that much beyond the high 20,000s, mid to high 20,000s of yards, it's just not really worth engaging past that, because if a enemy wants to not be hit, then because of the sheer amount of shell flight time, you can just evade. Just watch for the flash of the guns, put your ship's wheel hard to port, hard to starboard, go in a different direction, and assuming you're going at anything like an appreciable speed, you're going to be hundreds of yards away from the aim point, and unless the guns have horrifically wide spread, you're probably going to be out of the overall spread range as well by the time they land. And this is exactly what the Japanese destroyer captain did. Every time he saw the US ships fire, he'd just switch course, and then the shells would land somewhere else, and he survived. So yeah, it was a case of certainly with Iowa, not quite as much with New Jersey, but certainly with Iowa, they were probably following the best tactical situation they could. New Jersey's gunnery was still very good, so while they had made a minor mistake, it wasn't a massive one. But Nowaki was doing basically exactly what a ship that's being engaged at that kind of range should be doing. And between that and the fact that, well, at 32 to 39,000 yards, the circular area of probability for a battleship gun salvo is not especially accurate. You ended up with no hits. So, although all credit to New Jersey for getting a near miss. Cody asks, follow up to his question about the Graf Zeppelin as a commerce raider, what would the requirements be to make a good commerce interdiction carrier? And he goes on to list a number of potential requirements. So let's go through some of the requirements. Speed. Cody mentions high 20s of knots at least. I would tend to suggest you probably actually want low 30s, mainly because your primary opposition is going to be destroyers and cruisers, both of which can hit the low 30s at minimum. So if you're restricted to high 20s, you're probably going to be run down and killed in fairly short order, whereas if you can sustain 31, 32 knots minimum, you might still be run down by some of the faster ships in a very, very long chase, but the overall closing speed will be so low that A, they'll probably break off long before, and B, it'll give you a chance to get some aircraft in the air to deal with them. In terms of tonnage and range, yeah, mid-teens and long range for mid-teens for tonnage, yep, that's good. Air group of 36 to 42 aircraft, I think that's actually possibly slightly too high, because a 42 aircraft air group, at that point you've got an asset that will probably actually have a significant call for on the front lines of actual combat. Plus you've got the maintenance and servicing requirements of 42 aircraft, plus their pilots, etc. I think you might get away with carrying 42 aircraft, but an air group of 42 aircraft may be a bit too high. So maybe running in the high 20s to low 30s with the numbers then made up by reserve aircraft, which, given that you're going to be on a long distance, long range, long duration mission, will probably be quite necessary to replenish your air group as aircraft suffer either completely fatal mechanical breakdowns or get damaged in combat. Obviously, built in large enough numbers, yeah, that's obvious, good one. The other things that I would look at would be around protection. You do not want to get into a gunfight, so you want to concentrate your protection around at the heaviest dual-purpose guns and otherwise other air attack, other air defense stuff. You obviously want to be able to build it in large enough numbers. You want it to have a fairly extensive electronics suite, because radar for spotting both targets and incoming hostiles is going to be very, very important. And along with those reserve aircraft, you probably want a relatively, for its size, extensive repair and machine shop. And so overall, in actual fact, I think World War II did produce, near enough as makes no difference, the perfect hull for this kind of operation. It's just, it was produced by a nation that didn't really have any particular need to use it in that particular kind of format, and that is the Independence class light carrier. It's fast, it's reasonably well armed without being overgunned, it carries about the right size of air group, and of course, being the US, they could produce them in vast numbers. So yeah, that is probably spot on for as near enough as you're going to get for an ideal commerce raiding interdiction carrier. And finally, Absolute Zero asks, what would be various historical captains and admirals' reactions to the Yamato and a modern supercarrier? Choose whoever you think would be the most amusing. Well, outside of the rather obvious what in the blue blazes is that monster that most historical admirals would probably have as their first and default reaction, I think some of the more amusing ones would probably be people like Lord Cochrane and John Paul Jones, because the minute they spot in their respective cases either a non-white ensign or a non-American flag hanging from it, I think their second reaction would probably be, now how do I board and capture it? And then probably immediately set about plans of how they're going to try and accomplish that. Assuming the thing's teleported back to World War II, let's say the modern supercarrier is transported back to just before Operation Tango. Admiral Mitch's reaction would be one for the record books. I have a feeling it would be something along the lines of Agent Smith's evil laugh from Matrix Revolutions. Go and have a look on that on YouTube if you like. Yeah, I can just imagine him standing on the bridge of an Essex class looking at that, and that would be pretty much spot on his reaction when he gets the idea of, oh, how many more aircraft can I fit on this thing? And of course, the other one I'd have to put as the most amusing would be Admiral Fisher if he saw Yamato, because his first reaction would be to pound his fist on the table, throw his papers in the air, scrawl red ink everywhere, and just scream something like, "I knew it!" And then he'd look at the date of manufacture and go, 1940s? What happened? You amateurs, wait, what have you been doing the past 2 decades? And then promptly go off in a strop to write something in all caps about how clearly the pace of naval development has slowed down unforgivably in the years following his late and lamented passing. And that brings us to the end of this week's episode of The Drydock. Just a couple of bits of channel admin to get out of the way. Firstly, the second big wave of Thunderchild and Fleet Aeron posters have been dispatched. The Thunderchild posters are now back out of stock again. They seem to be very popular. There are a few A3 sized Fleet Aeron posters still available and plenty of A4s. If you happen to want to get yourself one of those. Hopefully, international postage allowing, most of the first wave of items should have arrived with their owners by now. And on a completely separate note, my large format scanner has still not arrived. This is very irritating. I'm hoping that they might bother to reply to my chasing messages in the next few days. Which is why there's only been a limited amount of updates to the Drachinifel.co.uk website. But as soon as that arrives, I will try and get more uploaded. And if it hasn't arrived in the next week or so, I'll try and do another batch with my much smaller hand scanner. But we'll see how that all goes. Other than that, thank you very much for listening, and hope to see you again in another video.